Did you know that Castlevania Aria of Sorrow got a cell phone port in 2008? Or that there's a completely original Castlevania mobile game that has never been re-released? I didn't until recently, which led me down a rabbit hole of gaming I never knew much about, and one that is often overlooked in mainstream video game canon: mobile gaming in the mid to late 2000s. Most commonly known online as J2ME games, they're often written off as not being important. They're just mobile games. But for millions of people, they were important, especially in countries where video games and consoles were either too expensive to own or had little to no support. Mobile games formed an experience for those who played them no less valid than those who grew up with Game Boys or PSPs. And if you had completely ignored mobile gaming, you're going to be shocked at how many games were released for them. Mainstream popularity of mobiles increased globally in the mid-2000s, and games released on them were sold at a fraction of the price of those sold on typical handhelds. Publishers saw an opportunity to reach millions of people they may never have been able to appeal to before. If you can name a game franchise, there is a 99% chance it had a mobile game come out in this era. Sonic the Hedgehog, Call of Duty, Devil May Cry, Drakengard, Street Fighter, Mega Man. If there was any way conceptually to get the game onto a mobile phone, it was taken. And of course, there's Castlevania. It had 8 mobile games in total from this era, though sadly only 5 of them are playable as of the making of this video. So let's quickly rattle off what I won't be able to show off today. The first is a port of the original Castlevania released in 2002. It's an early release for this era of mobiles, so the graphics have been very simplified. It's hard to tell how accurate it is to the original just from screenshots, so it's a shame I can't play it. I think it looks adorable. The second is a port of Castlevania 3 released in 2006. This looks like a one-to-one translation, though again it's hard to say that with any degree of certainty just from screenshots. Finally, there was a port of Kid Dracula, also released in 2006, that looks very faithful. Hopefully one day these games are found so we can play them for ourselves, but for now, let's dive into the 5 that are available in this episode of Port Patrol. Developed by the Code Monkeys, the same studio behind the Simpsons skateboarding, I didn't know what to expect going into Aria of Sorrow for mobile, though one thing I thought was at least a given was that it would run better than 10 frames per second. I've seen footage of this game running better than this, but no matter how many different versions of the game I tried from different sources, and no matter what emulator I used or what settings I changed, the frame rate stayed unwavering in its choppiness. So I don't think it's an emulator problem, I think the version of the game most readily available online is just unfortunately one that runs like this. So I do apologise for your eyeballs. Outside of that though, it's hard to know where to start because it aims to replicate everything that the original did, but falls short in basically every aspect, offering the barest of bare bones essentials of what it needs to work. The gameplay at least made the transition relatively intact, the frame rate thankfully not impacting responsiveness too much. It's not a perfect translation of how the original played, but I think it's close enough. I was able to adapt to the changes pretty easily. It's definitely more finicky. Making fine adjustments with Soma is basically impossible with how fast he moves, and overall it does feel a lot more floaty and imprecise, but it's not unplayable or anything like that. For most of the game it's serviceable and has all the basics covered. You have the 3 different soul types you can equip, as well as weapons, armour and items to use, and new abilities to find. Some like Gravedigger have been simplified, backdashing no longer being assigned to a button, but now automatically activating when moving away from an enemy. A little fiddly, and it doesn't always work, but it did come in clutch a few times. And other abilities like Hippogriff are basically broken, allowing you to levitate along ceilings in a way that looks really stupid. It might not all work great, but it works enough to still make playing the game and exploring the castle feel engaging. Though the castle itself is where you feel the constraints of the mobile format the most. It doesn't have every area that the original game had, and even what did make it here has been cut down dramatically, but it's been cut down in a really weird way. Like, if you're cutting out an area from the game, wouldn't you also cut out the transition corridor instead of having it awkwardly dead end, making it painfully obvious that something is missing? The amount of items to find has also been reduced, so some rooms are just left empty. Why wouldn't they cut these too? They also reuse rooms at times to cut down on file size. For example, the starting area has about 3 long corridors, so rather than create the 3 separate rooms in the mobile version, they just reuse the first one. But this first room has platforms leading up to an exit that the other rooms don't have, so now there are just these platforms leading up to a dead end because the room is in the wrong place. There are several spots in the game where this happens. It's very confusing if you don't realise what's happening straight away. You get a sense at several points that they were really struggling with the size of the map, even with it so cut down, with how much empty space there is with nothing to put in it. While it's commendable that it does attempt to recreate what is here as close as it can, I can't help but feel that after already cutting it down so much, that it would have benefited the game to redesign the layout a little bit more to better suit what they could fit. Though God knows if they would have been given the time or budget to make those sort of changes. Though I'm willing to bet the answer would have been no. Though, to be positive for a second, the music is pretty good. While the song count is reduced and some songs play in the wrong areas, what is here is well recreated and still slaps. Which is the most important thing in a Castlevania game if we're being honest. Though the music is a little evil, crashing the game whenever it loops. I don't think that's the game's fault. I'm willing to give it the benefit of the doubt and say it was the emulator. It's just very funny that it turned what would have otherwise been the very annoying fact that the music restarts every time you open the map or inventory screen into an essential tool to stop the game from shitting itself every 5 minutes. As you might expect, enemy variety has also been cut down, and I don't just mean the obvious ones from the areas that were cut from the game, but even the ones that are here have also had their complexity reined in too. If they had 2 attacks in the original, they will now just have 1, and many have had their attacks altered to match the behaviours of others, presumably to cut down on resources. Even with the reduced enemy count, there's still a decent amount of them though. It wasn't until I went back to play the original footage that I realised how much had been removed, but far more noticeable are the bosses. The only ones I remember still being in the game are the Creaking Skull, the Manticore, and Graham. Though even then, I think the Manticore doesn't count as a boss because it respawns, so it got demoted to just being a normal enemy, and Graham is missing his first phase, so he's only half a boss fight. The boss rooms will now just have random enemies in them, and very obviously stick out every time you walk through one. The enemy sprites themselves are also pretty funny. As a whole, I'd say the graphics of the game are nice enough. It's all just assets lifted from the original and simplified where needed, but the enemy sprites are all over the place, and I kinda love it. Some are just the originals and they fit in perfectly, others have been redrawn to suit the lower resolution of the phone screen, but in the process completely messed up the sizing, resulting in some enemies like the werewolves being half the size of what they're meant to be. And for some enemies they just said fuck it, and scaled down the sprite in Photoshop and called it a day, looking odd, blurry and blobby, and I respect that. It's definitely not the game to play if you hate pixel art with inconsistent sizing. Even Soma isn't immune to having his sprite a little too scaled up and blurry. There are so many differences in this game, even more than I could possibly list despite how thorough I'm trying to be. But despite how much is missing, I can't say I didn't enjoy my time playing it. I'm not sure I would call it a good game in the traditional sense, but I do like it, and found it fascinating to see this game, considered one of the best in its genre ever made, like this. So that's gotta count for something. It's commendable that it tries to retain so much, but there's also so much missing, and the way it's presented here makes it so obvious when it's missing. As a final example of this, and maybe the funniest, let's talk about the ancient books. In the original, there are 3 hidden books you can find. Though not mandatory items, their descriptions give hints about 3 souls you need to have equipped while fighting Graham to unlock the true final boss. The books are still here, and they still give the same hints, and all the enemies whose souls it mentions are in the game, so you might expect that it would serve the same purpose here. I expected that too, and spent ages grinding for their souls. But the game ends after you beat Graham no matter what. He's just the final boss now, with nothing else after. The books give hints to a puzzle that is no longer in the game. That isn't to say they're useless. A barrier blocks entry to the boss arena until you have all of them, so I have no idea why they decided to keep these hints in the descriptions rather than updating them for their actual purpose. Maybe they were planning to have all the stuff post-Graham in the game, but time or resource restrictions made it impossible, and they just forgot to remove the descriptions. I mean, maybe it's on me for expecting the game to have all that stuff in it when Julius, an important character in that arc of the story, is completely missing in this version. It's just another example of the weird, disjointed nature of this port. Considering how much cheaper these phone games were than traditional handheld games, I think it would be hard to feel you didn't get your money's worth at the time. It's a weird way to play Aria of Sorrow for sure, and while I don't think I'd recommend you play it to have fun now, I think it was well worth the playthrough for me, just to experience the game like this, and that, in its own way, became its own type of fun. However, this isn't the only version of Aria of Sorrow for mobile. With so many different phones out there, with different restrictions on things like resolution or max file size, these games often had several versions created to be optimised for different types of phone. For example, here's the same game but now running in a smaller resolution, and even a little smoother, so part of me wishes I played this version instead. The sprite art is even scaled correctly and not blurry. What a concept! But for as much as I ragged on Aria of Sorrow here, it looks like a masterpiece when compared to this version, made for even lower resolution and less powerful devices, clocking in at 1/10 the full version's file size. It is so cut back, I'm not even sure it can be classified as Aria of Sorrow anymore. There's still a map available, but basically every part of it that doesn't form a direct straight line from the start of the game to the final boss has been completely removed. There's no save rooms, there's no soul system, there's no music, there's one boss and like 4 enemies in the entire thing. There's money to collect, but the shop has been removed so there's nowhere to spend it. There's only 3 weapons to collect, which just act as power-ups, automatically applying to your character when you pick a better one up. It does try to keep some explorable areas that you can go back to when you unlock stuff like double jumping, but the rewards are not worth it. Often just a potion that barely offsets the damage you took getting there, but sometimes it's just straight up nothing at all. It is wild to me that even in a version that had to be as stripped back as this, it still has random rooms that are completely empty in it for no reason. Like, what were they doing? I don't know what else to say. I beat it in about 20 minutes, as opposed to the hour and a half the main mobile version took me. At the very least, it plays okay. It's higher than 10 frames per second, so that's cool, I guess. Its base gameplay feels about the same as the main mobile version, but it's just so lacking of anything. I think it's cool that they tried to make a version for people with weaker phones, but it's so far removed from what it's meant to be, you can't even call it the same thing. After everything I just talked about, I really didn't know what to expect from its sequel, Dawn of Sorrow. A larger game than the first, made with more powerful hardware in mind. After already seeing how much Aria struggled to make it across to mobile, I prepared myself for the worst, especially as it only came out 1 year later. My fears were for nothing though. This time the game was ported by the mighty Troglodytes, whose bread and butter were mobile games, producing versions of Spyro the Dragon and Leisure Suit Larry. The title screen says 2009, though they seemingly closed their doors in 2008, meaning that this could be the last game they ever made. And honestly, what a banger to end on. Despite all odds, Dawn of Sorrow is actually really good, and I mean that fully, without having to add for a mobile game or any other stipulations at the end of that. I mean, don't get me wrong, is it massively cut back and reduced in scale when compared to the DS game? Yes, but the cuts they've made make a lot of sense for streamlining the game to a mobile format, and they adapt the game around those changes in a way that feels natural, rather than trying to do everything the original did but shallowly like Aria. The laser-focused direction of this game means, sure, it doesn't do everything, but what it does really well. Take the castle, for example. It's roughly laid out the same as the original game, but has been redesigned from scratch in a lot of places. Many rooms have been redesigned with the new layout in mind, and there's no more coming across blatantly empty portions of the map where things used to be, making the most of every room in the game and trimming out anything that doesn't aid it. That feels great. At no point did it ever feel like there was something actively missing from any of these levels. Areas like Subterranean Hell are completely unrecognisable, removing the water mechanic entirely, and while it still doesn't encompass every area from the original, it covers a lot more than Aria did, and what is covered feels way higher quality. And the castle needed to undergo this big change, because of how many items have been removed. Nearly all of them. There's only 20 pieces of equipment to find, with 12 of those being weapons. Now this is a massive stripping back, and I was worried it would make exploring the castle feel less exciting, because there would be barely anything to find. And if I'm not out here looking for weapons and upgrades, then, well, what are we doing here? But now off the beaten path there are items like HP and MP up files like in Symphony of the Night that still make it rewarding to explore, as well as Lost Soul vials which fully heal you when your HP hits 0, kinda like the fairies from Zelda. Though not everything they tried here works. You can find these chests scattered around the map, often in earlier areas where you need a later ability to come back and grab it, which, you know, kind of implies that there'd be something good in them. But because there is basically nothing they can give you, all they ever give you are healing items, which, because there is no inventory system anymore, are instant use. It's always a waste of time to go back and open them. One unexpected side effect of all this was that it really incentivized using soul synthesis to upgrade my weapons, because the odds of stumbling onto something new were so small. It's a mechanic I didn't really pay much attention to on the DS, more so doing it as a, well, you know, if I get the soul I'll do it, but I'm not gonna go out my way or anything. But here it's like the only way to guarantee yourself a weapon upgrade, so I spent the time grinding out the souls for it, and it was honestly a lot of fun. What surprised me more than the equipment being scaled back though was that the amount of enemy souls to collect was also brought down massively. No longer does every enemy in the game give you a unique ability, there's only 12. The trade-off seems to be that the enemy variety is much more comparable to the original, and they retain pretty much their entire movesets. But 12 is like, that's so stingy. I used the same axe throwing soul for most of my playtime, and I never used any of the blue ones. I had one by the end of the game, and it sucked ass, so I never used it. But again, it's not all negative. Having less souls available makes it a lot easier to find the ones you need to upgrade your weapons, and enemies that have souls to drop now sparkle when hit, which also incentivizes you to try and get it there. Chances are you're gonna need it for something, but I still think that 12 is just way too little, and turns the souls from this sandbox system with so many possibilities and combos to experiment with into what just amounts to straight upgrades, with no reason or room to experiment. I appreciate the effort they put in to make the soul system work well with this few souls in it, but it could have really done with a few more to still retain what made it special. This might be the only thing that Aria did better, with every enemy in that game still having a soul to capture, though I think the better enemy quality does balance that out. Not to mention that this game actually has bosses. Some didn't make the cut, but it's still a vast improvement over the previous game's 3. Like, the jump in quality in just a year is almost staggering. Now of course, one of the coolest things about killing the bosses in Dawn of Sorrow was getting to take their abilities after, so, you know, it's missing that. And a lot of the bosses that got cut were the bigger, more impressive ones like Balor, which is also a shame. But what is here is good. Even keeping the seal system from the original, with the mobile keypad mapping pretty well to the position on screen, it's very satisfying. I remember wondering when the Dominus collection was revealed about what they would do to make the touchscreen seal drawing work without a touchscreen, but it turns out they already solved that problem 15 years ago. So yeah, I really enjoyed Dawn of Sorrow on mobile. It's compromised compared to the original release, but what they cut back on makes perfect sense for the platform, and only helped strengthen the game for what it could be. The reduction in scale left room for far better graphics, more music tracks, increased enemy quality, and gameplay that matches the original incredibly closely, all the way down to being able to make Soma do a little jig if you move back and forth. Now that's attention to detail. Sure, it's on the easier side, with no inventory system and enemies constantly dropping healing items. The only challenging spots are boss fights, and then with all the lost souls you collect, it's very easy just to tank hits if you do ever need to. Also, the music that plays in the Wizardry Lab, my favourite song in the whole game, sounds weird here with the wrong instrumentation playing at the wrong volumes, which is basically an unforgivable crime, so fuck this version of the game, it's actually really bad. But that's really all I can hold against the game. I fully recommend playing this one. And just like Aria of Sorrow, it also got a super low resolution version. First impressions are good. The gameplay is fluid and responsive like the main game. The graphics are simple, but still look pretty nice, with Soma's animations managing to remain smooth. But sadly, that's about everything positive there is to say about it. It honestly makes Aria's low-res version look feature-complete in comparison. There's no weapons to find, there's no items to use, there's not even a map. You just navigate through some rooms until you find Dimitri, and then you kill him, and then the game is over. My playtime was 5 minutes. I don't think there is anything else for me to add. I genuinely do not understand why they bothered, except of course I do because the answer is always money. And I can't help but feel bad for anyone back in the day who might have bought it after being tricked into thinking these two games were even remotely comparable to each other. Porting larger scale Metroidvania games to mobile has been a bit of a mixed bag then. So how does a smaller and simpler game like the original Castlevania fare? That is an awkward question to answer. This is Castlevania, Konami's second attempt at porting Castlevania 1 to mobile, released just 2 years after the first one in 2004, making it the oldest game we're talking about today. While that feels like it should make it significant in some way, sadly there isn't all that much to be said about it because of how much of it is lost media. Presumably because of how old it is, to fit within tighter file size restrictions, the game was split into 3 parts. But only the first part has been preserved. And that's a shame, because it's honestly a pretty good conversion, and I would love to actually have anything to say about it. The graphics have been updated, but are still very much based on the Famicom game, being like fancy paint-overs of that game's sprite art. Gameplay-wise, it's probably not one-to-one, but it feels close enough to me, and while the level design has been altered slightly, mainly breakable walls no longer being a thing, instead just spawning whatever object was meant to be hidden inside of it, next to it, it's still Castlevania. They're still well-designed levels, and the gameplay and controls hold up for the format, making it a fun way to play the game for the whole 8 minutes part 1 lasts. Even the tiny screen didn't bother me all that much. The game seems pretty accommodating of it, with enemies like Medusa heads spawning in a predictable pattern, and often in a way that you'll avoid them just by standing still. Neat. I would love to be able to play the other 2 parts of it, but God knows if they'll ever surface online. Part 1's been floating about since at least 2007, so it's not looking hopeful. Such is the unfortunate reality of game preservation on a platform that society sees on the whole as disposable, levels now only viewable as screenshots. But don't be too sad, because all is not lost. Because much like Aria and Dawn of Sorrow, it also got a low-resolution version. Welcome to Castlevania, a slightly better preserved version, with 2 out of 3 parts being available. Though, sadly, this version is quite a big step down from the main one. Visually, there's a lot going on here, completely scrunched down sprites and a non-moving background that took basically the whole playtime for me to get used to. Gameplay is also a lot slower and way less responsive. Serviceable, maybe. Playable, sure, but nowhere near as fun as the other version, and being quite difficult to emulate properly. I also had a problem with sub-weapons where it was almost like the button for them got stuck down and would constantly throw them out when I didn't want it to, seemingly stopping at random. I'm assuming, again, probably an emulator problem. I don't think this version is particularly worth seeking out, though I do think it's interesting in one way, which is when you compare it to the first mobile port. The HUD is an exact match, as are the level layouts. I'm willing to bet that this is that original version, just reskinned with graphics to match the newer one. And while that does sound pretty presumptive, I know, I do have a reason to think this, which is the 3rd version of Castlevania to be released on mobile, the Complete Edition. Which, as you can see by things like the main menu, and the way the breakable walls don't break but instead spawn items next to them in the exact same places, is essentially a reskin of the second port with nicer graphics, depending on if you think this new art style is an upgrade or not. Castlevania the Complete Edition, the 3rd and final port of Castlevania for mobile. How many more times can I say the word Castlevania in a single video? I feel like I'm going insane. This one never came out in Europe or America. Originally released in Japan in 2008, it came out in 2 parts, and thankfully both have been preserved so it's fully playable. This game is different to the others I've talked about in this video. Those were all J2ME games, but this is an iMode game, and needs a completely different emulator to play it. However, there was a J2ME version of the game made, released in China, combining both parts into one package. Now there are some differences between the two releases, with the iMode version being better overall. The music has more audio channels, making the songs feel more complete, and it can play sound effects while music is playing, which the J2ME release can't. The iMode release can seamlessly move between screen transitions without interrupting the music, whereas the J2ME version restarts the song every time, and some of the graphics have been altered in the J2ME release, though whether these new graphics are better or worse is subjective, I feel. They're pretty minor. Maybe the biggest thing the iMode release has going for it is being over 2 parts. It hasn't had to compromise on music for file size. Every song from the original game is here, as it should be, whereas in the J2ME release, they reuse songs in the final few levels, which really do not fit their vibes. However, despite all that said, I do not recommend playing the iMode version for one huge reason. This isn't the frame rate it plays at. This is. The game speed is locked to the frame rate, and the frame rate is way too high, making the game play twice as fast as it should. The J2ME version also has this problem. In fact, it might even play faster. But some J2ME emulators have the option to lock game speed to a set frame rate limit, so you can force the game to run at a playable speed. As far as I could find, there is no such option in Doja, the emulator for iMode games, and unfortunately playing it on older versions of Doja doesn't fix it either. By default then, for now, until better emulation options exist, the J2ME release has to be the one I recommend, even if it is, in a very few minor ways, the worst version. Either way though, this is a really cool way to re-experience the original Castlevania. While I'm sure the graphics aren't for everyone, Simon Belmont's out here looking straight out of one of those really makes you think anti-phone comics. It reminds me of the Sharp X86000 version, with really nicely detailed enemy sprites and absolutely adorable looking fishmen. Gameplay wise, it plays very similarly to the second port, obviously being heavily based on it, with some small improvements like being able to whip while ascending or descending stairs. And while I would love to say it's about as perfect as it could be based on that, there's one area they did mess up on that makes this version of the game way more annoying to play than it should be. The hit detection is kind of fucked. Like, genuinely, almost a deal breaker level of fucked. Many times your attack will completely miss hitting something, even though it very obviously shouldn't have, and it happens way too often for it to not be a problem. I'm talking about several times per level often. There are so many times where I died in this game because I went to whip an enemy or fireball while stood next to a platform, and the game decided that I missed, sending me falling to my death. Which turns from an annoyance to a massive problem when the game only gives you 3 lives with no continues. I tried so many times to beat this game, but honestly felt like how well my run would go was entirely up to luck. How many times would it fuck me over in the earlier levels, or just have me completely fall through a moving platform? This is also a problem in the iMode version, but at least that version has a level select on the main menu, so you can just continue that way. Here, if you run out of lives, you have no choice but to start again. It sucks because the game does do a lot to accommodate for being on mobile. In a lot of ways, it's actually a really easy version of the game. Food heals you to 100% health, enemy damage doesn't scale up to the crazy levels of the original, enemy attack patterns are a lot more forgiving, and all sub-weapons deal the same amount of damage, turning the dagger from one of the worst sub-weapons into one of the best. I think there's an argument maybe to be made that the game is too easy this way, especially when it comes to the bosses, which pose no threat at all. But I think it makes sense for the platform. I don't think anyone would want to play a Castlevania as hard as the original Castlevania on a mobile platform like this. If anything, my suggestion to you, if you want to play this version, is to make it even easier. Play it on easy mode. As far as I could tell, it doesn't change anything about how much damage enemies deal or how many there are. It just makes it so you no longer get knocked back when taking damage. It's a change I kinda wish I didn't have to make, but I think far more important than any made up need to play the game as it's intended is to play it in a way that's actually fun for you. Played like this, it's a cool looking, chill playing reinterpretation of the original, which, sure, still can't escape some of the issues that being on a mobile phone adds, like the screen resolution on the final stage meaning you have to make some really lame leaps of faith. I still had a lot of fun playing it, both the J2ME version and even the iMode version. Just about somehow playable at 2x speed on easy mode, though I would not recommend it, I just wanted to see all the differences for myself. Check out this foliage comparison and let me know what you think looks best in the comments, maybe. Or don't. Finally, let's talk about Castlevania Order of Shadows, a completely original game exclusive to mobile, and one that gave me a lot of trouble when emulating. I say this because at the default resolution it boots to, I honestly found it borderline unplayable. It's so zoomed in, and there is so little room to the sides of the screen that you have to practically attack enemies while they're off screen or you will get hit. I found it incredibly frustrating and honestly gave up playing halfway through, but then I found this second version with scaled down graphics for lower res phones, but it was playing at whatever resolution I had the emulator set to. Turns out you can set this game to play at crazy high resolutions and see entire rooms at once. It's very weird, none of the other games could do this, and made me think that maybe the default resolution it booted at was actually too small, and that's why I found it so annoying. A lot of the resolutions I tried felt too high and against the spirit of the platform, so in the end I settled on the default resolution, but in landscape instead of portrait. So for the purposes of this part of the video, please pretend I'm Cloud Strife from Advent Children with the sick as fuck phone I wish I could justify spending £150 on to own. Now, I don't know if this is a resolution common to phones at the time, it doesn't feel like an impossibility, but like I stated at the start of the video, I'm really new to this aspect of gaming, and I'm just finding things out as I go along, wanting to share the things I find. I think if just slightly changing the resolution of a game can turn it from unplayable to playable and let me show more of it to you, I think that's a worthwhile thing to do. Though, unfortunately, while it made it playable, that doesn't mean it made me like it. Order of Shadows was never released in Japan, being developed by an American team inside Konami. Most notably on the staff role is Tyrone Rodriguez. He would later go on to found Nicalis, who you might know as being responsible for the many ports of Cave Story, developing the Binding of Isaac Rebirth, along with some, not very cool and epic things. Not what I was expecting to find when researching this game, not going to lie. If I had to pick another Castlevania game to try and compare it to, the only ones that come to mind are Simon's Quest and Circle of the Moon. It's a weird game that tries to bridge the gap between Castlevania and Metroidvania, creating a new genre that's a mix of the two that I'm going to call Castlevania. Essentially, it has a lot of the things you would expect from a Metroidvania. You level up and equip new weapons, but there's no wide open sprawling map with multiple paths, it's very linear. There's a small hub area, which leads you to a level, which you play through, beat the boss at the end to unlock a new ability, and then you use it in the next hub area to go on to the next level. You can technically backtrack and go through old levels you've already beaten, though if there was any point to doing so, I couldn't see it. I don't recall seeing a single obstacle that I would have to go back to with a new ability to reach, outside of one candle in the first level you need to double jump to, which I didn't bother doing, so please let me know in the comments when inevitably the best weapon in the game was there and I'm an idiot for not getting it. So yeah, like I said earlier, I didn't actually enjoy this game very much, and while the uninspiring level design didn't help it, it could have honestly had the greatest exploration in the entire series, and I still would have come out the other side disliking it because the gameplay is just really awfully stiff. The controls are awful. Probably what you would imagine if you tried to think of the worst case scenario of how a Castlevania game on mobile would control. It just absolutely eats inputs. If you're moving right and then try moving left too fast, you stop moving. If you fall off a ledge and keep the movement key held down, you don't keep walking when you land, you stop moving. It's like everything you do resets you to a default standing state, and it's only detecting if a button has been pressed, and not if one is already being held down. Like how if you attack while crouched, even if you keep holding down the crouch button, you stand up anyway. And while that's annoying, it only gets worse once jumping is added. You jump by pressing up. You jump forwards by holding up. It doesn't matter if you're pressing one of the sideways movement buttons, the only thing that matters is up. Let go of up in midair while holding down the direction you're going, you stop moving. It's an incredibly strange system that I was not able to get used to, and makes attacking airborne enemies an exercise in frustration, as you have to do the lightest, featheriest tap possible of the up button to only jump directly up. Hold it down for a fraction too long, and you move towards the enemy, making dodging attacks or setting up to attack them basically guarantee you're going to take a hit. It is basically impossible to not move forwards when jumping up. Speaking of the enemies, I also didn't like fighting those either. A lot of the bigger enemies have crazy long range. Like I said at the start, they're able to hit you whilst barely on screen when playing portrait mode. They require that you leave so much space that you have to hit them with the tip of where your whip lands to avoid taking damage. In a game with incredibly stiff controls that makes making fine adjustments like that nearly impossible. The whip is also incredibly slow. It takes over twice as long for the animation to play out in this game as it does in the original, taking just over a second. It is impossible to play well with attacks this slow, in a game that eats your inputs if you dare press a button a fraction of a moment too early. Shout out the boss arena for Medusa though, seemingly implying that Simon Belmont from Haunted Castle died and failed his quest here. That's kind of fun. But anti-shout out to Medusa herself, and every boss actually. They will flash constantly to show that you are damaging them, but it's so excessive that you spend half the fight not being able to actually see what the boss is doing. Anything the game does to choreograph an attack coming your way is basically null and void by the fact you cannot bloody see them. Thankfully, at least, while a hard and annoying game to play through, it's not frustrating, if that makes sense. Death basically has no penalty, spawning you at the start of the room you're in with full health. So it's not hard to Haunted Castle the game and just push through, taking deaths to heal up and only using your healing items for bosses. I don't know, it's hard for me to think of anything else constructive to say about it. It's interesting for sure, trying to blend the two styles of Castlevania together, but it does so little with both of them, I can't help but feel the game would have been better off fully committing to one or the other. And if it didn't play like this, obviously. While it could have been a cool new interpretation of the type of game Castlevania 2 was, with the game only being 40 minutes long, it can't really do anything that exciting with the concept. There is definitely a novelty to playing it, knowing that this is mobile exclusive, but I wouldn't seek it out to try and actually enjoy it, just to experience it. It's by far the least fun I had playing any of these games. But yeah, that's everything constructive I had to say about the game, so I'm just going to end this segment by listing some things about it I thought were cool, but couldn't find ways to smoothly segue into when discussing my critiques. The sub-weapons are weird. While starting with normal items like crosses and throwing axes, it's not long before every other enemy you kill is dropping a legendary magical sword that deals like twice as much damage as your main weapon does. That's cool, I like that. There are also magical spells you can use, though these act as consumables. That seems like it would make them stronger than the other sub-weapons, but a lot of them are actually really weak despite how cool they look, and the only ones I actually found helpful were Reflect and Invincibility. That's not so cool, I don't like that. I love the way Desmond Belmont, you play as Desmond Belmont by the way, I love how his sisters walk in cutscenes, like whoever animated them had never seen a human being walk before. It's awesome, 2 thumbs up. Honestly, a lot of the animations are pretty penisy like that, but the graphics overall I think are nice. Like, if you saw screenshots from this game so you couldn't see it in motion, I think you would think it looks pretty comparable to the GBA games. That was meant to be a compliment, but it didn't come across as one. I'm gonna give that like a middling thumb. I think the music is cool too. The incredibly scrungly guitar sample in level 1 stayed in my head for days after I played it. There's also a classic music mode you unlock after beating the game, which replaces the game's original soundtrack with songs from the first game, which are also the exact same compositions as the ones used in the remakes. Double thumbs down, I'm tired of fucking hearing these songs. I've had to play Castlevania 1 so much for this. So that's all the Castlevania mobile games that, as of right now, are playable. Knowing so little about mobile games before starting to make this video, I had no idea what to expect, but I was honestly quite surprised. Sure, the games are scaled back and bad in the ways I would expect a mobile game to be, but they're also a lot better than I could have imagined in a lot of ways too, and I hope you come away from this video feeling the same way. It's an area of gaming I've slept on for way too long, and after only scratching the surface of what's out there here, I'm excited to finally give it the fair go it deserves and delve deeper into what mobile phone gaming had to offer. It's not like mainstream gaming where old games are re-released constantly on newer consoles, and where ROM sites have every possible game you could ever want for a given console. Mobile game preservation is flaky, incomplete, and all over the place. No website has a complete collection of what's out there, and what they have might not even work properly. There are efforts to improve this, such as the Keitai Wiki. Focused on Japanese mobile phone games, their wiki was an incredible resource for discovering new games, with labels saying whether or not they've been preserved and for what platform. This video would have been nowhere near as good without the work they had done helping highlight what games were out there, and I appreciate them taking the time to help me troubleshoot problems with the iMode version of Castlevania, even if sadly we couldn't fix the problem and get the game working at a normal frame rate. Hopefully one day a group as dedicated as them will sprout up for American or European J2ME game preservation, though with how obscure the topic is and how hard it is to find any information about it, maybe it already exists. I hope you enjoyed this video and I helped shine a light on an aspect of gaming you may have never known anything about before, and I apologise for the endless hours of troubleshooting you're about to endure to try and play some of these fucking games.